I was the first candidate in the country to run for a Green New Deal. It was a 2010, running for governor of New York as the Green candidate. And it became a signature issue of the Green Party over the next decade. Our presidential candidate, Jill Stein, ran on it as her central theme 2012, 2016. And then it became a national thing and went viral when the Sunrise Movement with the new Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York sat in Pelosi's office demanding a Green New Deal, which is great. And a poll was done a few weeks later, and 80% of the people want a Green New Deal, including 64% of Republicans. Right. But they couldn't get it through Congress. They had proposed a special committee, and Pelosi wasn't for that, so they came up with a non-binding resolution for a Green New Deal. Let's just say we're for it without really doing anything. And it was watered down. They took our brand and watered down the content. So they extended the deadline to zero out carbon emissions from 2030 to 2050. They dropped the demand for a ban on fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure, which is crucial. If we build that infrastructure, we're locked into burning fossil fuels for decades, and the planet gets cooked. We wanted to cut military spending deeply so we could put that money into a Green New Deal. They dropped that part. And then Pelosi won't let them vote on it. And in the Senate side, McConnell wanted to get all the Democratic presidential candidates on the record on the Green New Deal. And Schumer, then, the leader of the Democrats, said, oh, that's a trick. We're all going to vote president.
Right.
And all the good little Democrats in the Senate did, except for them voted with the Republicans, no. So Bernie is building a campaign for his ambitions. He's not building a political organization where you have a membership that from the bottom up makes decisions. In other words, a political party. Right. And what has happened to the left when it's gone into the Democratic Party, which it's been doing for generations, is it disappears. Right. They end up being the grunts, the people that do the door knocking, the petitioning, the phone banking for liberals who want to maybe patch up capitalism a little bit, but they're not really socialists. Yeah. And so we haven't had a socialist movement that is a major force in American politics for generations. And Bernie's not helping with that because he's bringing them into the Democratic Party. You go in the Democratic Party, they don't know if your vote's for a Sanders socialist, you're a Sanders socialist, or you're a Bloomberg corporatist, right? Right. You vote for the Green Party, everybody knows what that means. And that vote makes the politicians have to compete for you for those demands, like Medicare for all and the Green New Deal and Economic Bill of Rights. When I got 5% of the vote in New York in 2014, Governor Cuomo was running as pretty much a conservative Democrat. He'd been the real Tea Party candidate in 2010. Yeah. 2014, he wanted to run up the vote, get more votes than his daddy got, Mario Cuomo. More than he got in 2010, he got less. Now, there was a Democratic primary, Zephyr Teachout. She got about the same number of votes I did in the Democratic primary, then I got him in the general. The difference is, once the primary is over, she ended up endorsing Cuomo. And, her supporters all back Cuomo.
Right.
I got the same number of votes, and Cuomo had to pay attention. He had to now compete for that 5%. We were demanding a ban on fracking, we got that. A $15 minimum wage, we got that. Paid family leave, we got that. So my argument to the people that are with Bernie is that you're going to have more power if you get outside the Democratic Party and build an independent left party like the Green Party.
Sure. So another thing I thought was very interesting, because I work a lot on minimum wage issues here in Rhode Island, is you're calling for a $20 minimum wage, which is $5 more than $15 that we're not even able to get here in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Not even close. But tell me where the 20 number come from and how long have you been working on that?
Well, 20 by 20. I ran for it for governor in 2018. Yep. 15 is not a living wage in a lot of places with the cost of living, particularly here on the East Coast. If you adjust the minimum wage we paid in 1968 for both inflation and gains in productivity, in other words, how much output per hour of labor, it would be about $27 now. Right. So I think we can get right to 20 with maybe a 2-year transition. And I believe, like Franklin Roosevelt, he's a famous quote of his is, if you can't pay a living wage, maybe you shouldn't be in business. Yeah. Why should your business depend on paying people a poverty wage? So they're living in poverty and can't pay their bills. That doesn't seem like a good way to run an economy. So those are some of the thoughts behind it. Yeah. People work full time, they ought to be able to pay their bills.
Sure. Yeah, I used that quote in the piece I wrote over the weekend. When you talk about building a true socialist economy, What is a democratic economic, you talk about democratic economic planning. What does that look like?
Well, it means, let's take public power.
Yeah.
We've had a model, it was actually printed, a model legislation, actually printed in the Congressional Record, 1974, when we had that energy crisis, the Arab oil boycott, which was really also the oil company jacking up the price, using that as an excuse. And so you had conservative Democrats like Henry Jackson, as well as more progressive Democrats, saying we need to, nationalize the oil companies, which countries all over the world have done, left wing, right wing. I mean, it's like the oil, nobody made it, it's in the ground, it's like our common inheritance. And this was to have this was for state level, a public power system that not only controlled the utilities that generate and distribute electric power, but also had a fuels corporation that would take the fossil fuels and sell them instead of through the Exxons and the Chevrons and so forth, and then use the profits from those sales to build renewable energy. And so then it was governed by public utility districts, county size, depends on, or a city. And we have over 2,000 municipal utilities in the country, and then we have hundreds more rural co-ops. So we already have, we know it works. So you elect your, local board. In some cases, you elect the city council or the mayor, and they appoint the board. I think it's better to directly elect them, because then you can have a debate about your energy policies. And then from that level, they would elect a state board, and from there, a national board.
Right.
So the basic questions of what kind of energy are we going to choose? We're going to have nuclear, solar, wind. How are we going to site it? You have the basic policy questions would be debated as you elect those boards, and then they work out the details. So it would be democratic in the sense that the people set the basic policies, or would elect the people who run on the basic policies they support. So it'd be like a federation. It'd be a decentralized public ownership, coordinated at the center, but the initiative comes from below.
And you see that applying to a bunch of different industries, including like the banks?
Yeah, I think I would say the 6 biggest banks with assets of near $1 trillion or much more.
Right.
They are too big to fail, too big to jail.
Right.
We saw that in the Obama administration. But they're systemic. I mean, so they should be like public utilities, operate for public benefit at cost instead of for private profit, and do all the speculation, derivatives and everything, which is going to get us in trouble again.
Yes.
We're in a situation where the bubble could burst, and we're going to be in another financial crisis. Might even be worse than the Great Recession.
Sure.
So, and then we should have them at the state and municipal level. We've had for 100 years now, we've had a state bank in North Dakota.
Right.
And those Republicans up there love their Socialist bank because it partners with community banks. These are traditional capitalist banks, but they're locally owned. The per capita number of community banks and credit unions in North Dakota is off the charts compared to every other state. That's because they have this state bank that partners with them in making business loans, farm loans, student loans, mortgages, you name it. And they bypass Wall Street, and it's always returned net income to the state treasury.
Right.
And it's the state, really, DBA doing business as the Bank of North Dakota.
Sure.
And that has enabled these local banks, community banks, to survive without having to sell out to a Chase or what's another one, Citibank, the big national banks. And you get better decisions on risk that way, because if you're in a small town in North Dakota and somebody comes up to you for a loan, you look at their financials. Now, if you're a branch manager at Chase, you put a template on there and see if the numbers are good or not.
Right.
But if you're a local guy, you say, well, I know this person is coming in for a loan, and I know whether they have a work ethic. I know whether they, are persistent. I know who they are because I can get character references. So I can judge more than I can just see from the financials whether they're a good risk or not. So they make smarter loans.
Yeah.
So I think that's the kind of system. It doesn't have to all be public, but the public sector should be at least a yardstick up against which the private sector has to measure. The same thing in housing. I mean, we have enormous housing crisis now.
Sure.
Homelessness is off the charts. We have nearly 10 million people in extremely low poverty, don't have access to affordable housing, so they're in and out of homelessness. And the eco-social Green New Deal we're talking about, the housing thing we would do is build 25 million new units of public housing. That would, and 40% would be reserved for very low income. So that would cover the very low income that don't have access now. But they'd also be developments that would be mixed income. What we've done, what we did between World War II and about 1970, before we stopped public housing almost altogether, was we just segregate poor people of color off in the worst part of town, isolated from services and transportation and jobs and everything. And that just increased segregation. What they do in Europe is you've got professionals, blue collar workers and single moms with kids without much income, all living in the same apartments.
Right.
And that way we can, use this public housing program to help with desegregation. It's also a clean energy program. We'll power them by solar and wind. We'll heat them with heat pumps instead of gas or heating oil.
Yep.
So I think you can build a real coalition around that. The environmentalists, the civil rights people, the labor people, and the people who need housing. So that's another place where you would have federal funding but local control, like local public housing authorities.
Right.
Some of them are not very democratic. They're appointed by the mayor or whatever. That can be more democratic. I was just speaking to public housing tenants down there in New York where they're privatizing management. It's a real problem. And the private management's there to make money, not provide housing.
Exactly.
And NYCHA is big and there's a lot of corruption because the tenants don't have much control. Same thing with a job guarantee. We should have, like the Works Progress Administration during the 30s, local governments plan the projects. Federal government provided 90% of the funding, local government 10%. So they got to buy in so you don't have boondoggles. And then people, instead of going to the unemployment office, would go to the employment office when they can't get a job in the private sector, say, I want my job. And the local community's already decided, here are the public services we need, youth programs in the parks, or taking care of elders, or whatever the services are, or public works, I mean, my city of Syracuse, the sewers are collapsing.
Right.
Because they were built, in the late 1800s. They're wood and brick.
Where's that city?
Syracuse, New York.
Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, we have water main breaks and sewers collapsing. The roads are just falling into this old infrastructure.
Right.
And we can't afford to fix it.
Sure.
So that's a case where you have a national progressive tax structure, so you get the funds there, but you have decentralized administration. Because we know better in Syracuse what we need to fix up than somebody sitting in Washington.
Sure. Yeah, Rhode Island had a similar issue in that, like most of our sewage treatment plants are in places where it's going to flood due to climate change.
Yeah.
The next couple decades, and they'll all be underwater, and that's going to just put all that sewage untreated into the ocean. And we need to do something about it, but we can't afford to do anything about that either. Let me ask you, like in the section talking about social justice, we talked about open borders, like within the EU, which is a real difficult thing even in the EU right now, because I think it was the open borders question that kind of helped trigger Brexit.
Yeah, well, and that's a case where they have a Rust Belt, and I think the Labor Party did like the Sanders campaign is doing. They had a big campaign, got Corbyn elected with the Momentum Movement. They paid a few little dollars to become members,
Right.
but they didn't organize the constituent labor parties where they could organize with the working class in the what they call the Midlands, which is their Rust Belt.
Yep.
And they lost those people to the Tories. And they're historically always labor voters. Never should have happened, but that's what happens when you don't have a party with a grassroots organization that is talking to people. Because, immigrants are not why they got a Rust Belt there.
Yeah.
Same why immigrants didn't cause the Rust Belt here.
Right.
It was capitalists moving to countries like China and Mexico where they could get dirt cheap labor. And so, what was the question again?
Well, it's just like, so you talk about open borders, I mean,
open
and it
borders,
seems
yeah.
like I might like that idea, but I don't know how you sell that in a present political environment. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Well, first of all, the Republicans accuse the Democrats of wanting open borders, which they don't.
Which they don't. Right.
So part of the thing is, hey, we're over here, we're the open borders. You haven't even argued about it yet. Freedom of movement is a basic human right.
Sure.
It's recognized in the United Nations Charter for Human Rights in 48. Now, they were talking about freedom of movement within countries like South Africa, the Soviet Union, China had passed laws basically. But we want to extend that at least across North America between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Mexico, you know, that border moved on the Latinos in the Southwest United States.
Right.
They, you know, in the War of 1848, there's a treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave land rights to Mexican Americans, which have been violated, just like we violated Indian treaty rights. So from their perspective, they have family on both sides of the border. They should be able to move back and forth. And, you know, people don't need to worry that, oh, we open the borders, everybody's going to come here. If that was true, everybody would have left Greece for some other country in Europe.
Right.
Because Greece was a basket case economically.
Sure.
And the Greeks mostly stayed in Greece.
Right.
And most of the people that move are very ambitious and hardworking, so they're an asset. The crime rates are lower among immigrants and Native Americans.
Sure.
I mean, there's nothing to fear there. And the problem is the Democrats, you know, like Obama, the deporter in chief, and he was trying to like pander to the Republicans and try to get an immigration reform that wasn't anything near open borders, but maybe a little more rational than what we got. And the Republicans didn't give him anything. Because for them, divide and conquer are their politics.
Right.
We're going to scapegoat immigrants and Latinos and Muslims, and therefore we won't be looking at, you know, the companies that moved to Mexico or China, or the banks that stole our homes with robo-signing and predatory lending and predatory foreclosing. And because they weren't prosecuted under the last Democratic administration, now Wilbur Ross, right at the center, he had all these mortgage servicing companies. You know, robo-signing was just fraudulent paperwork to steal people's homes. He's running commerce. And Mnuchin was with One West. They were the worst of the predatory lenders and foreclosers. And he's running Treasury. They should be in jail for stealing people's homes.
Sure.
And now they're running the economy. And they want to tell us Greens we got to rely on the Democrats to stop these crazy Trumpites.
Yeah.
Well, the Trumpites wouldn't even be there if the Democrats had jailed the corporate criminals and also the war criminals. Bush administration tortured people, totally illegal. Yeah. None of them had any consequences except one guy in the CIA that said, we're torturing. He was a whistleblower,
right.
John Kirikow. And he spent a few years in prison for whistleblowing.
On the other hand, like I remember the last Green candidate for president did say there's no difference between Hillary and Trump shortly before the election. Because I remember I interviewed her in a similar situation. And so, do you still think that's the case? I mean, does that?
No, I never thought that's the case. They're different. Trump is an out-and-out racist. He's encouraging the white racists to come out, do violence to people. They've done it. They've done it to Jews, Muslims, blacks, Latinos, Muslims. You just don't put the Klan. I mean, to say like Susan Sarandon did, I thought this was an idiotic statement. She said, "Oh, if Trump wins, it'll wake people up."
Yeah.
It's like saying, we'll let the Klan take power after Reconstruction and it'll wake people up.
Okay.
You don't give them power.
Yeah.
So Clinton was terrible. She was dangerous. But Trump was worse. I've always felt that.
Yeah.
And I've been calling for his impeachment since he got in office and started getting emoluments, you know, right there during the inauguration.
Sure.
And then he made a bunch of racist statements and, you know, his oath is to faithfully execute the laws. Well, our laws are on paper anti-discrimination, and first thing he does is a Muslim ban, and then he does all those atrocities on the border. I mean, that was impeachable right there. And then we got all these obstructions of justice. I mean, this guy, and he just got let off, and then he's been doing impeachable offenses, you know, in the last week, and with respect to interfering with sentencing in the Justice Department and dangling pardons. I mean, this guy is, he's acting like an autocrat.
Right.
So he's impeachable. Clinton would have been bad, but, you know, this is brazen. Sure. So I never bought that. You know, between any two, you look, Mussolini was a lesser evil than Hitler.
Right.
But that doesn't mean I'm going to support Mussolini.
Right. I get that entirely. So it seems like reading your campaign goals that a lot of what your goals are is to strengthen the Green Party here in the U.S., to expand and strengthen the Green Party, right? Right. And so that, I mean, when you talk about, or when your literature talked about helping down ballot candidates, you know, in Rhode Island, I don't know that we have any down ballot candidates. I don't know that we've had a Green Party.
Well, we're going to have a meeting today. Maybe we can change that. I don't know what they have planned, but that's That's always been what the Greens have talked about. I think, look, we're running out of time. There's the climate,
Sure.
inequality, economic inequality is a life or death issue. Life expectancy gap between rich and poor is growing. It's a life or death issue for the bottom half of the population. And then we got this new nuclear arms race.
Yeah.
We can't, the good news for the Green Party is we've survived 35 years. A lot of things are coming on the left. The Labor Party, there was a 21st Century Party that women started. There was Ron Daniels coming out of the Rainbow Coalition, tried to start a party. And we survived, and we're still here. But now we got to step up because the Democrats and Republicans are not solving these existential issues.
Sure. And so that's where you see the Green Party stepping up, is like to help solve these existential.
I'm telling the Greens, we got to be. We've elected hundreds. We had between 100 and 300 local elected officials since Ralph Nader ran. Now we need to be electing thousands. Local and on that basis, state ledge, and Congress. And hopefully by 2024, we got a caucus in Congress, and whoever we run for president, it'd be hard to ignore them if we're in Congress.
So let me ask you, just wrapping up a little bit, like, talk to me about your background. How your background is like to put you in a position or to to be president?
Well, I've been a social activist and organizer since I was a teenager. And I got into this in the San Francisco Bay Area when we had a civil rights movement and an anti-war movement. We had a cutting edge of the ecology movement. And I very early concluded, watching both the Democrats and Republicans fail in '64 on the civil rights question. And then they escalated in Vietnam, and I ended up getting drafted. And
you joined the Marines.
I enlisted in the Marines when my number was called by Melvin Laird, the defense secretary. And it was officer training off campus. I was going to college. That's why I went to college to avoid the draft. And they got rid of the college deferment, so I got called. And then the college wouldn't give me scholarship until I got the GI Bill. So I was in catch-22. So I told the Marines, you got to send me to Paris Island, and I'll just be an enlisted guy for my 6 years. It was 2 years active, 2 years reserve, and 2 years inactive reserve. And they said, we'll get back to you. And I'm still waiting.
All right.
I have not got discharged formally. I got a military card in my pocket that expired in '76, but that's my documentation.
Right.
And they haven't ordered me anywhere. I was a little worried during the Iraq War because they were sending guys in their 50s to Iraq, but never heard from them.
Okay.
So yeah, I was in the military, and I went in the Marine Corps because there was a GI movement there resisting the war, and there were famous Marines like Smedley Butler and Daniel Ellsberg, and the former Commandant David Shoup, who came out against the Vietnam War. He didn't take a reappointment by Kennedy, and then when Johnson escalated, he was a vocal opponent. So I figured, yeah, there's some interesting people in the Marine Corps. Okay. So I got in there, and I concluded very early that we need an independent working class party for real democracy, socialism, and ecology. And in all my activism through all kinds of movements, I think I was right at the beginning. Most Greens are really angry former Democrats. You know, the Iraq War or some environmental issue or public campaign finance. Like they passed a referendum in Massachusetts and then the Democratic legislature wouldn't fund it. That was the last straw for Jill Stein. Right. So, but for me, it was always, you know, from a teenager, I was asking where was my party in 1964. Right. And so that's how I got into this, and, you know, anti-nuclear movement, anti-apartheid movement. I was in Teamster, a lot of labor movement, and, you know, strike support and strikes. And, you know, I've been pretty much constantly active. I worked as a construction worker and as a Teamster, but that was to pay the bills. I was really committed to these movements, and it was the 60s that got me involved.
Cool. And is there anything else I should have asked you that I didn't? Anything you want to touch on that I should have, that I missed completely?
You want to talk about the new nuclear arms race?
Yeah, we can talk about that. I usually try to keep on local social justice issues, but we can talk about the international stuff. Yeah, sure.
Well, let me just say a word about that. Is, you know, I'm campaigning on 3 life or death issues: the climate crisis, the inequality crisis, and the new nuclear arms race.
Right.
You may have seen that the bulletin of the atomic scientists just moved the doomsday clock to the closest it's ever been to midnight, 100 seconds. And it's because of the climate, it's also because of this new nuclear arms race. We're modernizing our nukes. They're strategic nukes. You know, the intercontinental ballistic missiles are now 6 times faster, which means you don't launch on warning. You launch, so you when you think the other guy might launch because you don't want to get wiped out in their first strike.
Right. Yeah.
And then we're putting more tactical nukes in the conventional forces. In this recent crisis in Iran, we deployed low-yield tactical nukes to our warships.
Interesting.
And if it hadn't kind of petered out like it did, we might be in nuclear war now.
And you know that Trump used the largest non-nuclear
Weapon in
weapon
Afghanistan.
Yeah, in Afghanistan, right.
Yeah.
And then, so I think he was building his way up to like using a low level nuke at some point.
Yeah, well, there's a new book out about the arms race called The Bomb by Fred Kaplan.
Yeah.
And I'm reading it. I haven't got to this part, but I heard it on a radio interview. He said, this happened a couple times. Trump will say, well, why can't I have, tens of thousands of more nukes like previous presidents did? And they'd explain it to him that we don't need it for strategic reasons. We're already bouncing the rubble. It's overkill. And Trump will go, okay. And then a few weeks later, he'll bring up the same issue again. I mean, the guy is not all there. So anyway, we're on a really dangerous situation. Meanwhile, 2 years ago, there was a treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons that was adopted by 122 nations.
Right.
They agreed to the text. And the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons got the Nobel Peace Prize for that.
Yep.
And as I go around, I rarely find anybody in my audiences that even knows that that happened.
Yeah.
That they got the Nobel Peace Prize, that there's this new treaty. So what I'm saying the Greens need to do, because none of the presidential candidates are talking about this.
Right.
We need to say U.S. policy should be no first use of nuclear weapons. Unilaterally disarm to a minimum credible deterrent. And on the basis of those tension-reducing initiatives, go to the other nuclear powers, none of which participated in this treaty that got adopted by those 122 nations, and say, we got to get rid of nuclear weapons. And I think with world public opinion as represented by those over 100 nations, and if we do it in the United States, our people in the world, they're scared to death.
Sure.
And we're into this arms race, and now it's Russia's doing it, China's doing it, India's doing it. Of course, India does it, Pakistan's going to do it. Pakistan does it, Israel's going to do it. I mean, we're off to the races, and we got some unstable leaders.
Right.
So this is a crucial issue, and if for no other reason, we need Greens out here raising that issue because the major parties are not.
Right. Actually, interestingly, I think it was the Democrats increased Trump under democratically controlled Senate increased the defense spending bill that Trump requested by billions of dollars. Right? He had asked for a certain number of ridiculous billions, and they increased it.
His first military budget was an increase, and they said that's not enough.
Right.
Yeah.
Which was shocking to me that they would give Trump more money than he asked for.
Well, there are deals to be made. Military-industrial complex. Like Bernie Sanders, he wants to cut the military budget, but not the F-35, because that's going to be based in South Burlington, Vermont.
Yeah, right. Well, that's the problem with all those things. They're always based around. Beaten up. But thank you. I think that was it. That was great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank
I
you.
hope I covered it well.
Yeah, we got.
Thank you so
got a lot of good
much.
stuff there.
I'm going to stick around and talk to people as they come in and
Sure.
some other stuff. But,
All right.
all right. Cool. Thank you. That was great.
Is it off?
Yeah, it's like this. Yeah, at least I'm not going to